Have we been praising the wrong war movies all along? Because some of the most brutal, honest, and psychologically devastating war films did not come from Hollywood. They came from Germany, a country forced to stare directly into its own darkest history. These 20 films do not glorify war. They expose what war does to boys, soldiers, families, and nations. But one film on this list still feels almost impossible to survive.
The Murderers Are Among Us, 1946. The war is over, but the real crime scene is still walking through Berlin. The Murderers Are Among Us is not a battlefield film in the traditional sense, but it may be one of the most important German war films ever made because it begins where most war stories end, in the rubble. Set in destroyed post-war Berlin, the film follows Dr. Hans Mertens, a former military surgeon haunted by what he witnessed and failed to stop during the war. Around him, the city is broken, but the more disturbing question is whether the people inside it are broken enough to admit the truth. The film's power comes from its moral anger. It asks whether ordinary life can continue when murderers have simply changed clothes, opened businesses, and blended back into society. Made in 1946, it feels like Germany looking into a cracked mirror for the first time. Its final punch is unforgettable. The war may have ended, but accountability had barely begun.
The Adventures of Werner Holt, 1965. Some war movies show soldiers becoming men. This one shows boys being tricked into becoming weapons. The Adventures of Werner Holt follows young Germans pulled into the machinery of Nazi ideology, and its tragedy is not just what they do, but how easily they are shaped before they understand the cost. Werner Holt begins as a teenager surrounded by slogans, pressure, pride, uniforms, and the dangerous romance of belonging. The film shows how war does not always begin with hatred. Sometimes it begins with excitement, confusion, friendship, and the desperate need to matter. That is what makes it disturbing. The battlefield scenes are important, but the real horror is psychological, watching innocence slowly become obedience. Made in 1965, the film stands as one of East Germany's most important anti-war dramas because it looks directly at the young generation swallowed by fascism. It is not just about fighting a war, it is about realizing too late that your life was stolen before it even began.
Europa Europa, 1990. A boy survives the war by becoming the very thing that should have destroyed him. Europa Europa tells the astonishing, true-inspired story of Solomon Perel, a Jewish teenager who hides his identity during World War II and is eventually mistaken for an ethnic German, pulled into the Nazi world, and even placed inside the Hitler Youth. That is what makes the film so tense. The danger is not only on battlefields, but in every conversation, every inspection, every uniform, and every moment where one wrong detail could expose him. Directed by Agnieszka Holland, the film feels like a nightmare of identity, survival, and moral terror. Solomon is constantly trapped between who he is and who he must pretend to be in order to stay alive. The war around him keeps changing borders, languages, loyalties, and uniforms, but his fear never leaves. Europa. Europa deserves this place because it shows war as a machine that does not only kill bodies, it forces people to erase themselves just to survive.
The Devil's General, 1955. Not every war film needs a battlefield. Sometimes the most dangerous fight happens inside a man's conscience. The Devil's General centers on a German Luftwaffe general during the Nazi era, a charismatic officer caught between military pride, political pressure, and growing disgust with the regime around him. The film is gripping because it explores a morally dangerous space, the world of powerful men who serve a system they may privately despise, yet still help keep it alive. That contradiction gives the story its tension. The general is not a clean hero, and that makes him more interesting. He is witty, respected, compromised, and trapped in a machine that demands loyalty even as it rots from within. Made in 1955, the film reflects post-war Germany wrestling with responsibility, resistance, and the uncomfortable question of how much guilt belongs to those who only served. The Devil's General stands out because it shows war not only as combat but as corruption of character. Its real explosion is moral.
The Tin Drum, 1979. This is not a normal war movie, and that is exactly why it belongs here. The Tin Drum turns the rise of Nazi Germany into something grotesque, surreal, childish, and deeply unsettling. Based on Günter Grass's novel, the film follows Oscar, a boy who refuses to grow up and beats his tin drum, while the adult world around him slides into madness. Made in 1979, it became one of the most internationally recognized German films because it does not explain fascism through speeches or battle plans. It shows it through family life, social rot, denial, absurdity, and moral decay. The genius of the film is that it makes history feel warped, almost like a nightmare remembered by someone who never fully understood it but absorbed all of its poison. It is strange, provocative, and often uncomfortable, but its impact is undeniable. The Tin Drum reminds us that war does not begin at the front line. Sometimes it begins at dinner tables, in parades, and inside ordinary homes. Lore, 2012. The war has ended, but for these children, the nightmare is only beginning. Lore follows the daughter of Nazi parents as she leads her younger siblings across a shattered Germany after World War II. What makes the film so gripping is its perspective. Lore is not a soldier, not a resistance hero, and not an innocent in the simple sense. She is a child raised inside a poisoned belief system, suddenly forced to face the collapse of everything she was taught. Made in 2012, the film uses silence, landscape, hunger, suspicion, and physical exhaustion to create an atmosphere of moral disorientation. The journey becomes more than survival. It becomes a brutal awakening. Every abandoned road and every ruined building seems to ask the same question. What happens to children after adults destroy the world and then disappear? Lore is powerful because it refuses easy comfort. It shows that the end of war does not instantly create truth. Sometimes truth arrives slowly, painfully, and too late. Land of Mine, 2015. Peace arrives, but the ground is still waiting to kill. Land of Mine is one of the most emotionally punishing war films of the modern era, even though it begins after the fighting has officially ended. Set in Denmark after World War II, it follows young German prisoners of war, forced to clear buried mines from the coastline. The film is Danish-German, but its place on this list is earned because it confronts German soldiers not as battlefield symbols, but as frightened boys paying for a war they barely survived. Made in 2015, it asks a painful question. When justice follows horror, how easily can justice become revenge? The tension is almost unbearable because every step in the sand could be fatal. The quiet beach becomes a battlefield without gunfire. What makes the film unforgettable is its emotional conflict. You understand the anger against Germany, yet you cannot ignore the youth and terror of the boys. It is a war film about aftermath, guilt, punishment, and fragile mercy. A Woman in Berlin, 2008. Some of the most devastating war stories happen after the army has already entered the city. A Woman in Berlin focuses on the fall of Berlin in 1945, seen through the eyes of a German woman trying to survive as the city collapses under occupation, hunger, fear, and humiliation. Made in 2008, the film is difficult, restrained, and emotionally heavy because it explores civilian trauma without turning history into simple victimhood. That balance is what makes it important. It shows German suffering, but against the background of a war Germany started, and a society that has now been forced to face the consequences. The main character's survival becomes a series of impossible choices, where dignity, safety, and morality are constantly under threat. The film is not built around battle scenes. Its war is inside apartments, basements, streets, and whispered negotiations for survival. A Woman in Berlin is unforgettable because it shows that when empires collapse, civilians often become the final battlefield. Before the Fall, 2004. This is what happens when a school stops teaching children how to think and starts training them how to obey. Before the Fall, also known as Napola, is one of the sharpest German films about Nazi indoctrination because it focuses on elite training schools designed to shape boys into future servants of the regime. Made in 2004, the film follows a talented young boxer who enters this privileged world and slowly discovers the cruelty hiding behind discipline, honor, and national pride. The setting is not a battlefield, but it feels just as dangerous because every lesson is designed to kill empathy. The film is powerful because it shows seduction before brutality. The uniforms look impressive, the opportunities seem real, and the promise of belonging feels intoxicating. But beneath that surface is a system that rewards hardness and punishes conscience. Before the Fall works because it shows how war prepares itself long before the first shot. It begins by turning children into believers, then believers into instruments. 13 minutes. 2015. One man came within minutes of changing history, and almost nobody talks about him enough. 13 Minutes, also known as Elser, tells the true story of Georg Elser, a German carpenter who attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler in 1939. Made in 2015, the film stands apart from many resistance dramas because Elser was not a powerful officer, a famous politician, or part of a grand military conspiracy. He was an ordinary man who saw the danger early and acted when many others stayed silent. That makes the story both inspiring and painful. The film builds its tension around the knowledge that his bomb missed Hitler by just minutes, turning the title into a cruel reminder of how close history came to a different path. But the movie's real strength is not just suspense. It shows moral clarity in a time of mass obedience. 13 minutes proves that resistance does not always begin with armies. Sometimes it begins with one person refusing to pretend evil is normal. The Counterfeiters, 2007. Inside the machinery of death, the Nazis built a workshop where survival came with a terrible price. The Counterfeiters tells the story of Jewish prisoners forced to create fake British currency for the Nazis during World War II, turning a concentration camp into a place where skill could delay death but never erase fear. Made in 2007, the film won major international recognition because it finds tension not through battlefield action, but through moral pressure. The prisoners are trapped in an impossible situation. If they cooperate, they help the enemy. If they refuse, they may die. That conflict gives the film its sharpest edge. The main character, a master counterfeiter, is not presented as a perfect hero. He is practical, damaged, clever, and desperate to live, which makes him feel painfully human. The film's genius is that every printed note becomes a symbol of compromise. The Counterfeiters is not only about survival, it is about the unbearable cost of staying alive inside a system built to destroy you. Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, 2005. The quietest room in this countdown may be the most terrifying one. Sophie Scholl, The Final Days does not need tanks, trenches, or explosions to crush the viewer. Its battlefield is an interrogation room, and its weapon is conscience. The film follows Sophie Scholl, a young member of the White Rose resistance movement, after she and her brother Hans are arrested for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets at the University of Munich. What makes the film so powerful is its restraint. Sophie is not shown as a superhero. She is frightened, intelligent, stubborn, and deeply human, which makes her courage feel even more devastating. The tension comes from knowing she is facing a system that has already decided the outcome, yet she refuses to surrender her moral truth. Every question from the interrogator becomes a trap, and every answer becomes an act of resistance. This is not a war film about defeating an enemy with force. It is about standing upright when fear wants you to kneel. The Zone of Interest, 2023. The horror is not shown directly, and that is why it becomes impossible to escape. The Zone of Interest is one of the most chilling modern films connected to Germany's wartime past, because it focuses on the domestic life of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss and his family living beside the camp. The film's terror comes from contrast. Children play, meals are served, flowers grow, and family routines continue while unimaginable suffering exists just beyond the wall. That distance is the entire point. The movie does not chase shock in the usual way. It studies the banality of evil, showing how ordinary comfort can survive beside monstrous cruelty when people choose not to look. Its sound design becomes more disturbing than any graphic image because the viewer understands what the characters are trying to ignore. This film belongs high on the list because it exposes a different battlefield, the moral numbness of people who built normal lives beside destruction. It is cold, precise, and unforgettable. Cross of Iron, 1977. This is the Eastern Front, with the romance stripped off and the mud left behind. Cross of Iron may not be a German production in the strictest sense, but its German soldier perspective makes it impossible to ignore in this countdown. Directed by Sam Peckinpah, the film follows a hardened German platoon leader, Steiner, as he clashes with a glory-hungry officer during the brutal fighting against Soviet forces. What makes it stand out is its raw, cynical energy. The soldiers are exhausted, disillusioned, and trapped between enemy fire and their own command structure. Peckinpah's style gives the violence a jagged, chaotic force, but the real punch comes from the film's hatred of military vanity. Steiner is not interested in medals or patriotic speeches. He understands that survival has replaced ideology. The film turns war into a dirty contest between men who suffer and men who chase honor from a safe distance. Cross of Iron is gritty, angry, and brutally clear-eyed. The Captain, 2017. A stolen uniform turns one frightened deserter into a monster. And the scariest part is how quickly everyone believes him. The captain, also known as Der Hauptmann, is one of the most disturbing German war films of recent years because it shows authority as a costume people are desperate to obey. Set in the final chaos of World War II, the film follows Willi Herold, a German deserter who finds a captain's uniform and begins impersonating an officer. What starts as survival mutates into something far darker. The film's black and white photography gives it a cold, historical nightmare quality, while the story exposes how easily power can corrupt someone who was powerless moments before. Herold's crimes are horrifying, but the film's deeper accusation is aimed at the system around him. People follow, assist, and enable him because the uniform gives permission. The captain is not just about one false officer. It is about a society so addicted to command that even madness can look official. The Bridge, 1959. No film understands the tragedy of teenage soldiers quite like this one. The Bridge follows a group of German schoolboys in the final days of World War II, when they are ordered to defend a small, militarily insignificant bridge. That setup sounds almost simple, but the emotional damage is enormous. These boys have been raised on slogans, uniforms, and heroic fantasies, yet they are thrown into a war that is already collapsing. The film's greatness lies in how carefully it watches innocence turn into terror. At first, the boys think they are being given purpose. Then the reality of combat arrives, and the heroic dream becomes panic, confusion, and loss. Made in 1959, the film became one of Germany's defining anti-war classics because it confronted a painful truth. Entire generations were sacrificed to ideas they were too young to question. The Bridge is heartbreaking because the battle itself is almost pointless. That is the horror. They are not dying for victory. They are dying for nothing. Stalingrad, 1993. This is not a battle movie. It is a slow march into frozen hopelessness. Stalingrad follows German soldiers on the Eastern Front as the campaign turns from confidence to catastrophe. The film begins with men who still believe they are part of a powerful military machine, but that illusion dies, piece by piece, in the snow, rubble, hunger, and fear of Stalingrad. What makes the movie so effective is its refusal to make war feel clean or noble. The soldiers are not presented as simple heroes. They are men trapped inside a brutal invasion, slowly crushed by conditions, orders, and the consequences of the war they serve. The atmosphere becomes suffocating because every scene seems to remove one more layer of hope. Friendship matters, but it cannot stop starvation. Courage exists, but it cannot defeat winter. Stalingrad earns its place near the top because it shows defeat not as a single event, but as a psychological collapse. By the end, survival itself feels like a miracle. All Quiet on the Western Front, 2022. A young man signs up for glory and finds only mud, screams, and a death machine waiting for him. All Quiet on the Western Front brings the famous German anti-war novel into a modern cinematic form, and its power comes from how mercilessly it destroys the fantasy of heroic combat. The story follows Paul Baumer, a young German soldier in World War I, whose excitement is slowly erased by trench warfare. The film's imagery is brutal, but its emotional impact comes from the contrast between youthful idealism and industrial slaughter. Paul and his friends are not born warriors. They are boys fed speeches by adults who will not bleed in their place. The trenches become a world of mud, rats, gas, artillery, and pointless advances across ruined ground. This version feels especially devastating because it connects personal terror with political indifference. Men die while officials negotiate, delay, and protect their pride. All Quiet on the Western Front is not just anti-war, it is anti-delusion. Downfall, 2004. The empire is burning, but inside the bunker, denial still has a voice. Downfall is one of the most intense German-language historical dramas ever made, because it places the viewer inside Adolf Hitler's final days in Berlin without turning history into myth. The film's power comes from confinement. Outside, the city is collapsing under Soviet assault. Inside, the bunker becomes a sealed chamber of fear, loyalty, madness, and moral rot. Bruno Ganz's performance as Hitler is chilling because it shows not a monster from legend, but a human being whose fanaticism has dragged millions toward ruin. The film also watches secretaries, officers, doctors, and loyalists as they react to the end they helped create or refuse to prevent. That is what makes Downfall so gripping. It is not only about one dictator dying, it is about the final atmosphere of a regime collapsing under its own lies. The movie leaves you with a cold truth. Evil often ends not with grandeur, but with panic. Das Boot, 1981. The greatest German war film ever made does not need a wide battlefield. It traps you inside a steel coffin under the ocean. Das Boot follows the crew of a German U-boat during World War II, and its genius is claustrophobia. The submarine becomes a living prison. Sweating pipes, stale air, narrow corridors, exhausted faces, and silence so tense it feels louder than explosions. Unlike many war films, it does not sell combat as adventure. It shows young men packed into a machine that can become their tomb at any second. The crew members are not shown as cartoon villains or glorious heroes. They are frightened, bored, loyal, cynical, brave, and doomed in ways they barely understand. That complexity is why the film still feels alive decades later. Every depth charge becomes a heartbeat. Every creak in the hull feels like fate knocking. Das Boot earns #1 because it turns war into pure psychological pressure. By the end, the ocean itself feels like judgment. War movies often promise courage, but the greatest ones leave you questioning the cost. These German films do not celebrate battle. They expose fear, guilt, obedience, survival, and the ruins left behind. Which film hit you the hardest? Drop your pick in the comments and subscribe for more brutal, forgotten, and essential war movie countdowns.